Down at the bottom. That'd be great. Thank you.
Just clicked it.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. I am Ms. Danielle Seymour. I teach at Baker High School in Mobile. My co-host this evening is Jill Green, and she teaches at Hewitt-Trussville High School. Ms. Green will be monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions or issues, she's going to be watching that chat for any of that. As you're joining, just keep in mind you'll need to use that join code and go to joinpd.com. All right, so let's go ahead and start off by asking which statement best describes you at this moment. And I just want you to drag the check mark to whichever one of those statements best applies to you. All right, I'm seeing a lot of somewhat confidence. That's great. That's a good place to start from. Just keep in mind, some of you may not have gotten to this content yet, and that's okay. This will be a good way for you to go ahead and preview the content before you start going over it in your class. So let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to be talking about in this study session, obviously we're looking at personality. That's our major topic. So we're going to be identifying the contributions of major researchers in personality theory, and there will be several. We're then going to look at those different theories of personality and compare and contrast them. We're going to describe and compare research methods that are used to investigate personality, and then talk about how personality is assessed and discuss those assessments to determine whether or not they're both valid and reliable. All right, so when we're talking about personality, it's important to keep in mind we're really talking about a characteristic pattern of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So for each of these statements, I want you to pick A if you think the statement is true, and B if you think the statement is false. And we're going to go over them briefly, but I just want to go ahead and have you respond to each one of those. All right, it looks like most of you have had a chance to respond, so let's go ahead and look at each one of these statements. Starting with number one, personality is a person's characteristic thoughts, emotional responses, and behaviors. Since we immediately gave the definition, then most of you have probably already figured out that's a true statement. So when we're talking about somebody's personality, that's really what we're looking at, is that pattern of thoughts, emotional responses, and behaviors. Number two, as a result of twin studies, we know that a very low percentage, less than 20% of personality variation is a product of genetic variation. That statement is actually false. Studies have shown that roughly 50% of personality can be attributed to genetics. So when we're thinking about personality, if we're looking at nature versus nurture, we could say roughly 50% of our personality is nature. Number three, innate differences in neurotransmitter levels have been linked to different personality traits. Actually, that is true. Specifically, the neurotransmitter dopamine has been associated with traits like novelty seeking or seeking out new adventures, etc. And serotonin is associated with traits like emotional stability. Let's look at number four. There are no sex differences for personality traits associated with temperament. Some of you may have already intuitively known the answer to that is absolutely false, because girls are typically better able to focus and control their attention, whereas boys tend to be a little bit more impulsive, also active. Number five, childhood temperaments are very different from adult temperaments and do not predict one's personality in adulthood. That's also actually false. Since personality is a person's characteristic pattern, we tend to see a lot of stability when it comes to personality from childhood all the way through adulthood. So childhood temperament can be very predictive of adult temperament as well. And then last one, number 6, people do not always act in ways that are consistent with their personality traits. That's absolutely true. In many instances, we have to maybe consider the situation or the environment someone is in. They may actually act in a manner that's not consistent with their personality traits. Great job. All right, so now we've got more practice ahead of us. So what you're going to do here is look at each one of these 4 theories and then just draw a line from the theory to the definition of that theory. And then we're going to talk about each one of them. Be sure to at least give it a try. Even if this is unfamiliar, maybe look for some keywords, and we'll talk about that when we go over these. All right, looking pretty good. So we're going to go in order. Number 1, psychoanalytic theory actually matches bullet point number 3. This is a theory of personality that attributes thoughts and actions to unconscious motives and conflict. A more modern version of psychoanalytic theory focuses less on the unconscious and more on our childhood experiences. So if you're familiar at all with psychoanalytic theory, not just in personality, but in general, some keywords to look for are always going to be unconscious motives and unconscious conflicts, also childhood experiences. All right, number 2, behaviorist theory. So behaviorist theory actually matches with bullet point number 4. So these theorists believe personality is an adaptation to the environment. So a way to think about that, because there's not a lot of keywords there to work with, but behaviorists believe that we tailor our behavior to the environment. Whether a behavior is rewarded or punished by the environment, we learn to kind of do more of what works and less of what doesn't. So behaviorist theory would correspond in the same manner. Number 3, humanistic theory matches with bullet point number 2. Theories that view personality with a focus on the potential for healthy personal growth. And those last 3 words are the biggest key words associated with humanistic perspective or theory. Healthy personal growth. That's what humanistic psychologists are always focused on. Last one, number 4, is trait theory. So by process of elimination, you've probably figured out that one matches with the first definition. Trait theorists believe we can describe people's personalities by specifying their main characteristics, which are thought to be stable and to motivate behavior. So those main characteristics are essentially those traits, that characteristic pattern that we tend to see emerge in people. And we're going to talk about each one of these in greater depth. All right. So let's try a multiple choice question. I want you to be sure to read really carefully and think about some of those keywords we just talked about. Which scenario below is most descriptive of the psychoanalytic theory of personality? Even if you're not sure, at least give this one a try. Remember, this is just for practice. All right, it looks like most of you have had the opportunity to answer, and it looks like we are between answers A and D. A is the correct answer, so let's talk about letter A, but I also want to touch on letter D as well, since several of you chose that one. So letter A is the correct response. Charlie is overly precise and methodical in everything he does, to the point that he is constantly annoying his family and misses deadlines at work. Dr. Katz believes that this is because Charlie never moved past the anal stage of development. So if you're not really familiar with the psychoanalytic theory of personality, you may not have gotten to Freud's psychosexual stages just yet. There is the oral stage, the anal stage, the genital stage, and so on, obviously very unfortunately named. But Freudian psychoanalytic theory of personality believes that if someone doesn't fulfill that psychosexual stage of development, they're kind of stuck in that place and they keep coming back to it, and it creates this unconscious conflict. Let's look at letter D, because several of you chose that response, and I'm guessing it's because it said as a child. So Carrie is very shy, and her therapist thinks this is because her parents punished her for trying new things as a child. Although it does indicate a childhood experience, the difference is what that childhood experience is. She was punished for trying new things. That would actually match better with a behaviorist theory of personality, because she's now changed her behavior as a result of the punishment or reward she received from the environment. So that one was a little tricky. Just make sure that you're always reading them carefully and looking for any potential keywords you can spot. All right, so let's talk a little bit more depth about psychoanalytic theory, and a great sort of image to match up with that is the iceberg that you see on the screen, because Freud believed there were three components to personality. There was the id, the ego, and the superego. So a good way of thinking about this, if we're using that iceberg as a demonstration, that part that's above the water, that conscious level, is going to be our ego. And what's primarily under the water or hidden beneath the surface is largely going to be our id and superego. So according to Freud's belief, the id was a part of our unconscious mind, and it housed our drives, our desires. It operated on the pleasure principle and wanted like immediate gratification. Our ego is a part of our conscious mind. And again, you can see it's above that water level. So the ego's job is to try to balance the demands of the id, but still also try to balance the demands of the superego. And the superego, a good way to think about it might be your conscience. The superego operates on the morality principle. So I like to tell my students, it's like the old cartoon you may have seen where you have the devil on one shoulder and the angel on the other. The devil on one shoulder kind of represents the id. It wants what it wants, and it wants it right now. It wants instant gratification and doesn't think about the consequences. Whereas the angel on the other shoulder is the superego. That's the morality or conscience that's always thinking about what the right thing to do is. So the ego's job there in the middle, that conscious part of our personality, has to find a way to mediate between the demands of the id and the superego, but in a realistic manner that's hopefully going to bring about more pleasure than pain. So kind of finding a way to compromise between the two. Another big component of psychoanalytic theory of personality is something called the defense mechanisms. There are 7 that are pretty familiarly used. So the defense mechanisms are used by the ego to protect itself against these socially unacceptable feelings, thoughts, beliefs, etc. So the most commonly used defense mechanisms, and you may have already covered some of these in your class, rationalization is one. Rationalization means whatever behavior you do, you find a way to justify or rationalize it. Sublimation, you channel more aggressive impulses into something that's more socially acceptable. So if you're someone who works out whenever you're stressed, that would be an example of sublimation. Denial is exactly what it sounds like. You don't want to face up to something, so you just deny that it even exists. Repression kind of works in the same way. It's you're repressing, or I tell my students, think of it as literally like pressing down these aggressive urges and impulses. Projection is essentially, if you think of what a projector does, you're projecting your negative or aggressive emotions onto another person, sort of like the I'm not mad, you're mad. If we think about rejection, again, it's what it sounds like. And then reaction formation is an interesting one because it sounds like you're forming a reaction, and that's true. The difference here is you're forming a reaction that's the opposite of what you actually feel, because what you actually feel isn't really socially acceptable. So while somebody may make you mad and you want to just pop them, of course you can't do that. So instead you might say, well, bless your heart, or something like that. Okay, you're forming the opposite reaction. All right, let's tackle another multiple choice question. One feature that distinguishes Carl Rogers' person-centered approach to personality development from behaviorist approaches to personality development is that the person-centered approach suggests that. So really focus on the language of this question and give it a try. May also be helpful to think about the fact that Carl Rogers was a humanistic psychologist. So maybe let that be a guide for you as well. All right, let's give it another minute or so. Like I said, even if you're not sure, give it a try. All right, so the correct answer to this question is letter D. So let's briefly talk about why that is. First, when we look at letter D, if we know Carl Rogers was a humanistic psychologist and was person-centered, then it makes sense that he would believe personality is shaped by unconditional love and support for children's behavior because he wants children to reach their full healthy growth potential. If we look at letter A, you may have recognized the words unconscious defense mechanisms. So that would be psychoanalytic theory. Obviously, that one wouldn't work. Personality is an innate characteristic. This is more like trait theory. Personality is conditioned through rewards and punishment in letter C. That would match with behaviorist theory. So if we look at letter E, although we see that wording again about personality being conditioned, anytime we see the word conditioning or rewards and punishments, that's always going to match up with behavioral, not humanistic. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about behavioral theory. If you have already covered learning in your classes where you talked about things like classical and operant conditioning, then you may already be familiar with this concept. Behavioral theory believes that we learn a reaction to situations. In other words, we tailor our reaction to whatever the situation is. If it's a situation that punishes us, we may learn to avoid that. If it's a situation that rewards us, then we may continue to go back and, back to that again. But it's this pattern of learned response. So of course it involves an interaction between the individual and the environment. Now, people, according to the behavioral theory, people can be trained through rewards and punishments, not just to develop certain behaviors, but to develop certain personalities as well. For example, if you are in a situation where you're basically told like children should be seen and not heard, that might discourage you from speaking up and it might make you more quiet and shy and reserved. So in that situation, the environment would have a direct impact, not just on your behavior, but maybe even on your overall personality. A big name to remember associated with behavioral theory is B.F. Skinner. He's considered like the father of operant conditioning. You may remember studying about his research working with pigeons and rats. So now let's talk about humanistic theory. According to humanistic theory, humans have free will. We're not held back or dictated by our past, and there's a major emphasis on our personal awareness and growth. The goal of humanistic theory is always moving in a path of healthy growth potential or reaching your full potential. Two biggest names to remember associated with humanistic theory are Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. So speaking of Abraham Maslow, some of you may recognize the hierarchy of needs on the screen. According to Abraham Maslow, he believed that we were motivated by certain factors, but that our physiological needs like food, water, and shelter had to be met before we could move up to our emotional and psychological needs. All right, let's try another multiple choice question. Priscilla has recently found diaries from her family dating back multiple generations. She has noticed that there are similarities in their life events and in the way they thought about things that happened to them. She believes that it has to do with the fact that they all have the same inherited instincts that drive their behavior and that these instincts exist in all humans. Priscilla's way of thinking is most in line with. This is a tricky one, so give it your best shot and then we'll talk about it. Well, as surely as I said this was a tricky one, I can see that many of you were not fooled and you immediately went to Carl Jung's collective unconscious. So just briefly talking about Carl Jung and this idea of the collective unconscious, essentially it has to do with this sort of form of the unconscious mind that contains these memories and impulses that seem to be passed down or inherited from generation to generation. And that doesn't necessarily mean like explicit memories, but think about it as an inherited sort of cultural memory or relating to things in the same manner as your ancestors would have. According to Carl Jung, that represented the collective unconscious. All right, so we've already talked about psychoanalytic theory, and psychoanalytic and psychodynamic can kind of be used interchangeably. So let's briefly talk about neo-psychodynamic theory. Anytime you see the prefix neo, always remember it's just new. So these are people who essentially used Freud's basic dynamics of psychoanalytic theory, but they either added on some component or they modified some component. So this neo-psychodynamic theory emerged from a criticism of Freudian psychoanalytic theory. Many researchers believed that there was too much of an emphasis on things like sexual drives and forces. There was a rejection of the inferiority complex where you have a conflict that's based on fears of inadequacy. Fears of abandonment were also something that was added to this neo-psychodynamic theory. We mentioned Carl Jung just a moment ago. He's a neo-Freudian, so he contributed this idea of the collective unconscious. So some names to remember associated with this theory, like I said, these are going to be people we might refer to as neo-Freudians, would be Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, and Karen Horney. And you may be interested to know that Adler and Horney specifically believed that Freud focused a little bit too much on masculine bias. So they tried to eliminate some of what they thought were misogynistic views, and they incorporated more ideas about women. They kind of included women in this theory, so to speak. All right, next is trait theory. Now, according to trait theory, people's personality can just be described by traits, certain traits that we exhibit. The most modern system associated with trait theory is the Big Five, and some of you may already be familiar with that. The Big Five, one of the things I love about it is it has a really helpful acronym. You can either refer to it as ocean or canoe. Either way, all the letters are going to work because the 5 traits are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, this trait theory is also rooted in the belief that traits are generally stable over time, particularly as you age. So if you remember one of those earlier questions asked about our childhood temperament being a sort of predictive factor for adulthood, trait theory would absolutely say that's the case because it believes that those traits stay relatively stable. If you tend to be very extroverted as a young child, you're probably going to be pretty extroverted as an adult. Some of the names to remember associated with this theory are McCrae, Costa, and Eysenck. And the Eysenck is actually Hans and Sybil Eysenck. They differed a little bit in terms of the Big Five because they believed that, and their theory is actually called the biological trait theory, but they believed that instead of this Big Five of personality, we actually had 2 major dimensions, introversion versus extroversion, and then emotional stability or instability. Those were kind of the 2 dimensions they were looking at. So if we wanted to compare that to the Big Five, you could really say that the Eysencks were more focused on extroversion and neuroticism, okay? All right, so in summary, the personality theories that we've talked about, this is looking at it in a framework of nature to all the way to nurture. So from a biological approach, we always want to focus on anything biological, anything natural, so genetic, hormonal, neurochemical explanations of behavior. With psychoanalysis, remember some of those key words, innate, unconscious, drives, conflicts. Childhood is usually a factor associated with psychoanalysis as well. Cognitive psychology believes that innate mental structures such as the schemas we develop, our perception of events, our memory, are being constantly changed by the environment. And we're constantly being shaped by our environment because the way we think about things is changing. Humanistic, remember this is Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. So Maslow emphasized those basic physical needs, but then believed once those physical needs are met, we can move on to more emotional and psychological needs. Maslow also believed, and the humanistic theory believes, that society influences a person's self-concept or the way that we think about ourselves. And then on the opposite end of the scale, we have behaviorism, in which all behavior is learned from the environment through a system of conditioning. Our behavior is either rewarded or it's punished, and we learn from that. So now that we've talked about some of those personality theories, we're going to look at some ways that personality can be assessed and investigated, and look at some of the research methods that are used. So before we start, let's try another multiple choice question. And again, I want you to read this one really carefully, because even if you're not really familiar with a lot of personality theory, you might do really well with this question. A researcher wants to understand the personality characteristics and motivations that might help explain a famous political figure's rise to power. She studies her early childhood experiences and other formative events in her life. The method this researcher is using to study personality is known as. So even though it's in the context of personality, this is going back to Unit 1, looking at those different types of research methods. All right, looking good. So as most of you indicated, the correct answer here is A, a case study. So a couple of keywords I want to point out in the question. For one thing, it says she studies his early childhood experiences and other formative events in his life. In order to do that, this researcher would have to look at past information. For that reason, an observational study wouldn't really work here. An observational study would mean that the researcher is observing the political figure right now, observing their behavior, etc. If she's studying something about their past experiences, that would always be a case study, okay? All right, so when we think about the science of psychology, remember, and hopefully this framework looks relatively familiar to you. Like I said, this is going all the way back to Unit 1. But when we think about case studies, these are referred to as descriptive methods or descriptive research. And the reason for that is because that's literally what they do. They describe a behavior. They might describe the impact past events had on a behavior. The same is going to be true of a naturalistic observation and a survey. At best, all they're really going to be able to do is describe a behavior, not necessarily root out the causes of the behavior. Remember, anytime we actually want to determine cause and effect, we have to use an experimental method. All right, let's tackle another multiple choice question. Belle takes a test to develop an inventory of different aspects of her personality. She hopes to better understand herself and the kind of person she is. The test is most in line with A. Again, look for some of those keywords that might point you in the right direction. That's always going to be helpful with multiple choice questions. All right, fantastic. So most of you correctly identified the correct answer as D. A big keyword here is that wording of different aspects of her personality. That's literally describing her traits, okay? So speaking of traits, what you see on the screen on the left, those are those big 5 traits. So if we were looking at a personality inventory that would assess our personality traits, then we would see those big 5 right there in the center, and we would either have a low score or a high score, or we may be in a middle range. But how we score on each of those individual traits is going to give us some insight into who we are as a person, or it may even be a way to estimate the likelihood that we may have a psychological disorder. Now, on the other side, what are some common problems that self-report measures like personality inventories have? Think about that for just a minute. If you're taking a survey, for example, or if you're doing a personality inventory in which you're self-reporting behaviors, one of the biggest problems with any self-report inventory is bias. We may not be as forthcoming, we may not be as truthful, we may give what we consider to be a more socially desirable answer that doesn't actually reflect how we truly feel. So anytime we have a self-report measure, that's going to suffer from the exact same trend that we see in other self-reports. People want to make themselves look more socially desirable or favorable, so they might potentially distort their answers. Okay. All right, so let's try another multiple choice question. Projective tests, such as the Rorschach inkblot test, have been justifiably criticized as tools for assessing personality because. So look over each of the answer choices and see which one you think is the best fit. All right, looking good. So the correct answer here is letter C. And this is one of the problems with some projective tests like the Rorschach inkblot test. They haven't been found to be reliable and valid. So what you see on the screen is an example of one of the inkblots on the inkblot test. Essentially, this is considered a projective test because you would be asked to look at the inkblot and then describe what you see. Well, let's talk about some of the problems with that. For one thing, there's a reliability issue, because reliability is going to be the extent to which a test yields consistent results. But by nature of this test, you're not going to get consistent results because everybody who looks at that inkblot could see something different. Now, when we think about validity, this is the extent to which a test measures or predicts what it was designed to do. So if we're looking at this for predictive validity, for example, how would we know which response would predict a certain behavior? So for that reason, the Rorschach inkblot test has been criticized. And again, it says justifiably, because we would want personality assessments to be as reliable and valid as possible. So we just talked about the Rorschach inkblot test, and that's the series of 10 inkblots that were developed to potentially identify someone's inner feelings by analyzing how they interpret those inkblots. Another one that you may not be as familiar with is the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. So an example of the TAT is on the right side of your screen, in which someone would be shown a pretty ambiguous picture where it could be interpreted in a variety of ways. So in a thematic apperception test, you'd be shown an image like the one on the right, and then asked what's happening in this scene, what are the people feeling in this scene, etc. And basically the story that the person makes up to explain what's going on in this picture could potentially reveal their own inner feelings and interests based on the type of story that they made up about a scene that could have various interpretations. So when we look at research methods that can be used to investigate personality, again, this is hopefully familiar territory. A lot of these you saw back in Unit 1. So with a case study, obviously this is a pretty inexpensive one to use. It involves a very in-depth study of one individual in particular. Some of the perspectives that would incorporate this method would be psychoanalytic and humanistic. So the benefit, less expensive than other methods. The weakness, it's not going to be generalizable to the larger population. And you're going to find that to be true with most descriptive methods. They tell a great story, they provide a lot of description, but they're not necessarily this template that we can then apply to the population at large. Surveys kind of fall into that same category, and probably most of you at this point in your lives have taken one survey or another. So the trait perspective, or the perspectives that would incorporate the method of survey, might be trait, social cognitive, maybe even positive psychology, where you're asking people to self-report their attitudes. The benefit to this is results tend to be reliable, and especially depending on your sample size, they may be generalizable to the larger population. A weakness, surveys may potentially be expensive to conduct, especially if you're looking at it on a larger scale. And at best, all they're going to provide is a correlational finding. In other words, we can determine that there is a relationship between two variables, but not much else. The projective tests that we just looked at, the TAT and the Rorschach, Obviously, both of these involve an ambiguous stimuli, whether it's a picture or an ink blot, and that's supposed to trigger someone's inner projection or their projection of inner dynamics. So as you would probably suspect, because it's supposed to trigger these inner dynamics, psychodynamic perspective would use this method. And it's designed to dig into the person's unconscious. It might be a good icebreaker, but as we mentioned, especially with the Rorschach, the results are going to have very weak validity and reliability. In other words, we're not going to really be able to do a whole lot with them. Now, personality inventories are a little bit different. Probably the most recognizable one is the MMPI, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This one is used to determine scores on Big Five personality factors. The MMPI, I believe, has 567 questions on it. They're all phrased as statements, and then you're asked if you agree or disagree, or if the statement is true or false. Now, the good news about the MMPI, it's objectively scored, and it's generally reliable and empirically valid. The problem is that it only explores a limited number of traits. The MMPI was actually originally designed to diagnose emotional disorders, and that's still considered to be its best use. But in doing that, it can also reveal something about the person's traits, etc. So just keep that in mind. Observation, or naturalistic observation. Here we're obviously observing and studying how individuals react in different situations, ideally with no interference from the researcher. So perspectives incorporating this method would likely be social cognitive, examining how our thoughts and behaviors may be impacted by our social environment. So a big benefit is this allows researchers to study the effects of those environmental factors in a very naturalistic way and see how the person's personality is expressed. Again, though, one of the issues with naturalistic observation, because it is a descriptive method, the results may not apply to the larger population. So we may not see any generalizability there. The last one is experimentation. Anytime we're talking about experimentation, we're talking about manipulating variables using random assignment. So perspectives incorporating this method, again, might be social cognitive, depending on what they're trying to determine. The benefit to experimentation always, and one of the things that separates it from the others, is it's able to discern cause and effect. The weakness, some variables cannot feasibly or ethically be manipulated. So ethics are a big concern with experimentation in particular. All right, guys, let's move on. We are going to tackle some free response practice, okay? So in looking at the free response practice, and if you've been in one of these sessions before, then you've already seen some of these general rules or guidelines. So I'm just gonna kind of run through them very quickly. First, answers must be cogent enough for the student's meaning to come through. What that means is your spelling and grammar mistakes don't necessarily count against you or reduce your score, as long as the spelling is close enough that your meaning comes through. I like to tell my students, I use the example of conscience and conscious, because those are both terms that could be associated with AP Psych. You need to be able to distinguish between the two. Just, relying on spelling may not be enough for the reader to gauge your meaning. Number two, a student can earn points only if the student clearly conveys what part of the question is being answered. In other words, if you choose to answer out of order, and sometimes that may be your best way of finishing on time, but if you do, make it very clear to the reader which part of the question you're answering. If you answer out of order, the reader cannot necessarily infer that you answered part A, then part D, unless you clearly mark that for them. Probably the most important one is number three. The response, and all FRQs involve application. So the response has to apply the concept to the prompt. You can't just define the term and expect to earn the point. There's a lot more to it than that. It's not enough to know what the term is. You have to know how it would apply in a real world situation. Number four, examples provided in the scoring guidelines, and we'll look at those when you're done, aren't necessarily considered to be exhaustive. They're kind of like exemplars, but they're not necessarily the only way you could respond. Number five, within a bulleted question part, a student will not be penalized for misinformation unless it directly contradicts correct information that would otherwise have earned a point. So for example, if a response applies a concept in two contradictory ways, like identifying both measured variables as the independent variable, or describing proactive interference as interference from both older and newer information, the point won't be earned, because in both of those examples, you're contradicting yourself. Both variables can't be independent. One has to be independent, one has to be dependent. So just make sure that you're not contradicting yourself. Last one, within a bulleted question part, if the response addresses details from a scenario other than the one in the prompt, the point is not earned. If your teacher is anything like me, and my students can attest to this, I give lots of examples, and some of them come from my own life or my own experience. And I do that just to illustrate a concept. However, when you're answering an FRQ, you want to make sure that you're always sticking to the scenario of the prompt. You're not going to be able to give an example that your teacher gave you or one that you've experienced if it has nothing to do with the prompt, because you're not going to be able to earn the point. All right. So let's take a look at your question. Malia has an assignment to write a research paper for a class. She has several weeks to work on the paper before turning in the finished product. So part A asks you to explain how each of the following could apply to Malia's completion of the assignment. And obviously, since your task verb is explain, you're going to need to go into greater depth. So you're looking at Albert Bandura's theory of self-efficacy, a low score on the Big Five trait of neuroticism, external locus of control, and efferent neurons. So remember, for each one of those, you want to explain how they would apply to Malia completing the research paper. In part B, notice that it shifts. Malia's teacher, Mr. Berry, has many papers to grade. Explain how incentive theory might apply to his success in grading the papers. All right, I can see some of you are already writing, so Ms. Green and I are going to be very quiet and give you about 25 minutes to respond so that you'll have plenty of time to answer each part. And Jill, I can start from the top if you want to start from the bottom. All right, guys, let's take about 5 more minutes. It looks like several of you are finishing up. So about 5 more minutes, and then we'll start going over the scoring guidelines. All right, guys, let's take about 1 more minute. So if you're still in the middle of writing, just try to get to a stopping point, okay? Ms. Green and I have been working diligently to try to give you as many of you feedback as possible. All right, let's go ahead and start looking at the scoring guidelines for this question. So let's start with point 1. If you were in the last session a couple of weeks ago, then self-efficacy was covered in that session. But just as a reminder, self-efficacy involves a belief in your ability or a confidence in your abilities. So in order to score the point, the response would have to meet one of these 2 criteria. The response must indicate that Malia believes she has the ability to write a good paper, and that facilitates her finishing her assignment. Or you could take the opposite approach. The response must indicate that a lack of belief in her ability to write a good paper makes it less likely she would finish the assignment. So either direction you go, remember, self-efficacy involves a belief in your own ability or a confidence in your ability to do a task. So if she has high self-efficacy, then she's going to feel like she can write a good paper. If she has low self-efficacy, then she wouldn't. So some examples of correct responses, and again, these are just exemplars, so they're not exhaustive. Malia believes she can write a good paper, so she does her research and gets a good grade from her teacher. That absolutely scores because, again, it indicates her belief that she could write a good paper. Or Malia is unsure whether she can write a good paper, so she procrastinates and ends up not doing well. Here you can see they chose the opposite track, but again, still indicated a belief. She's unsure about whether or not she can do it. All right, point 2. Look like several of you did really well on this one, but just as a quick reminder, when we're looking at those big 5 traits, and neuroticism would be the last one if we're using that OCEAN acronym. For most of the traits, we might feel like a high score is a good thing. Neuroticism is going to be the exception. A high score in neuroticism would indicate emotional instability, stress, etc. And since the prompt specifically indicated low neuroticism, then your response needed to indicate what that score would look like. So calmness, emotional stability, security, low anxiety, low depression, and then connect that to her completing the paper, either it helping her or hindering her in completing the paper. But again, you had to indicate something to describe that low score in neuroticism, not the opposite. So an example of a correct response could include the following. Malia exhibits a sense of calm so she can complete her project on time. Because calm would indicate a low score in neuroticism, that would absolutely score the point. So just as a quick tip here, even though they didn't specifically use the word neuroticism, by using the word calm, that's a clear indication that they understand that calmness would be a factor associated with low neuroticism. All right, point 3, external locus of control. I know I really stressed this when I was talking about locus of control with my own students. Whether we're talking about internal or external locus of control, again, the key is belief. So for external locus of control, the response would have to indicate that Malia believes that outcomes are determined by external forces outside her control, whether that's fate, luck, destiny, circumstances, other people. None of that matters as long as it's something outside of herself, and you indicate that she truly believes that something else outside of her is going to determine how well she does on the paper. So some examples of correct responses. Malia thinks that fate determines her life, so she doesn't take proactive steps to do her paper. Even saying thinks that fate determines her life indicates that that's her belief, so that would absolutely work. Malia thinks that random factors determine her life, so she doesn't put in the effort to complete the assignment. So here again, they're using the word thinks, but because they're indicating external or random factors, they're clearly indicating an external locus of control and then directly tying that to completing the work. Malia believes that the teacher is biased against her, and so she doesn't even try to complete the paper. Here they explicitly used the word belief, and because the teacher is another person external to Malia, this would also work, and again, it tied it to the completion of the paper. So again, anytime you're thinking about external locus of control, and I will tell you, this was a concept that was on FRQ, I think 2, on one of the forums last year. External or internal. If you're talking about a locus of control, you have to indicate a belief on the person's part. If they exhibit an external locus of control, then they truly believe that what happens is out of their control. All right, point 4, I could tell this was one, it's probably been a while since you've covered, so this one wasn't quite as familiar, but still a very important one. So you may remember probably back in the unit on Unit 2, when you were talking about biological bases and you talked about neurons, your teacher likely indicated the difference between efferent and afferent neurons, or motor versus sensory neurons. So since you were asked about efferent neurons, a good sort of tip to think about efferent neurons allow us to give effort, because efferent or motor neurons involve some element of motor movement, and that would indicate that Malia would need those to complete her paper. So there's lots of different ways you could go with this, as long as you're using motor movement and tying it to her completion of her paper. So for example, you could have said Malia's efferent neurons help her move her fingers so she can type her paper. Similarly, you could have indicated that her efferent neurons allow her to write the words on the page. Just about anything, as long as you're using motor movement and tying it to her completing the paper, would work here to score the point. All right, now part B asked about Malia's teacher, Mr. Berry, and wanted you to apply incentive theory to him grading the paper. So for that reason, anytime we're talking about incentive theory, we're talking about some kind of desired activity or external reward that's used as a motivator. So your response had to indicate that a desired activity or an external reward motivates Mr. Berry, and that helps him complete the grading. So just some examples of correct responses. You could have said, Mr. Berry sets a goal that if he completes his grading, he can watch his favorite television show. Here we've directly indicated completes his grading and then the external reward of watching the favorite television show. That would absolutely work. Second example, after every 5 papers he corrects, Mr. Berry rewards himself with 5 minutes on his favorite social media account. So again, this is still tying it to grading the papers and rewarding him in some way with some external factor or desired activity. So with the first one, the desired activity would be the favorite television show. Here it's his favorite social media account. As long as you're clearly establishing that and indicating whatever that external reward or desired activity is, and it motivates him to complete his grading, then you're going to score the point. One quick thing I want to say that I did notice in some of the responses, and this is not necessarily a criticism because we still have a few weeks till the exam, and that's a good thing. Just keep in mind, you know, with these units, it's never just a one and done. You always need to be reviewing that vocabulary, because AP Psychology has something like 840 terms. Obviously, that's a lot of terms to try to memorize, and nobody realistically expects that, but it's going to be a lot easier for you to commit those terms to memory if you're still going back and reviewing them. So just kind of make sure, if you haven't been doing that, that you maybe start doing that as we move closer to the exam. Because as you can see, a good grasp of vocabulary is really crucial, especially in answering the FRQs. You have to know what the term is to be able to apply it to the prompt. All right, so we asked you this question at the beginning. We're going to ask it again. Now that we have gone through the lesson, which statement best describes you at this moment? Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of very confidence now, and that's great. Even if you moved from not yet confident to somewhat confident, that's still a good thing. That's still progress. All right, fantastic. So we have reached the end of the session. This Google form is a way for you to give us feedback about the session. Ms. Green, if you would put that in the chat box just so it's easily accessible, that'd be great. The survey should take you maybe 2 to 3 minutes tops to complete. And just keep in mind, your responses are a way for us to tailor these sessions to best meet your needs. So please just take a couple of minutes and get that done. Now we have a couple more minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and just move to that last slide. But if you have any questions, Ms. Green and I are still available for a few more minutes. If you want to ask about anything, we're more than happy to answer your questions. And if you don't have any questions and you're all finished with your survey, enjoy the rest of your evening. And Jill, if you are filling out that Google teacher form, I was going to say the teachers that I saw in the session were Elise Weeks and Trisha Forsyth, if you just want to know their names. Hey, Elise.
That's who I have.
I was worried I was rushing a little bit, but it was because with all the technical difficulties, we got started a couple minutes late. So I was terrified like we weren't going to get finished on time. But
No, that was, yeah.
Yeah. I'm always happy at the end of it.
Oh, I know.
But you know, when we do finish a couple minutes early, I always like to give students an opportunity to ask something if they have any questions.
Because last time we did have that, we had some questions in the thing. I lost the chat. I mean, I lost the waiting room. Were you letting people in the waiting room?
Yeah, I clicked admit all once we got to 401. I'm sorry, I should have told you that. I saw we were running behind, so I went ahead and just clicked admit all.
Yeah, well, then also it was like there were a couple of other people, like I saw our numbers going up. So I was like, how are these?
Yeah, if I got a notification that somebody was in the waiting room, I was just admitting them.
I just never, I was like, and then when I was messaging people, like privately, it has me as DS. So I don't know. Yeah. So it's
today
like,
was just not a great day for Zoom or any of it. I mean, like I said, I got home. I mean, I came home immediately after school because I'm always anticipating technical issues or whatever, and then start trying to log in. I mean, like I said, I was trying to get in as early as like 3:20, and it took me, well, you saw how long it took to finally get in and have everything ready. So
yeah, like, okay, so do I have to have, all I need open is I need the Zoom on one and I need my Pear Deck on the other. I don't need the students